You are being lied to right now. Not by me, by your own brain. In the 3 seconds it took you to process that sentence, your mind ran over 200 unconscious calculations, made at least 4 assumptions about my credibility, and already began forming an opinion about whether this book is worth your time. You did not choose any of this. You did not feel it happening. And here is the part that should genuinely disturb you. Those invisible calculations are wrong more often than you would ever want to believe. The smartest people in the room are not protected from this. They are the most vulnerable. Because intelligence without a thinking system is just a faster engine driving in the wrong direction. Let me prove it to you with a story you have never heard. In the winter of 2008, a team of the most brilliant financial minds on Wall Street gathered in a Manhattan conference room. These were not average bankers. They were the elite, graduates of Harvard, Wharton, MIT, professionals who had spent decades mastering risk analysis, probability models, and market dynamics. Their average IQ was estimated above 140. Their combined bonuses the previous year exceeded $200 million. And in that room, over the course of 90 minutes, they made a series of decisions that would collapse their firm, vaporize $40 billion, and trigger a global financial crisis that destroyed 26 million jobs worldwide. Here is what makes this story important for you. When investigators later examined what went wrong, they expected to find fraud, deception, criminal negligence. What they found instead was something far more terrifying. The decisions were made in good faith. The analysis was sophisticated. The people involved genuinely believed they were being rational. The problem was not a lack of intelligence. It was a specific, predictable, documentable failure in how human brains process information under certain conditions. A failure that operates in your brain right now. In every meeting you attend, every negotiation you enter, every important choice you face. This failure has a name. It has been studied for over 50 years. And despite thousands of research papers, hundreds of books, and endless corporate training programs, 96% of professionals have no systematic way to protect themselves from it. You are about to become part of the 4% who do. But first, I need to show you something uncomfortable about yourself. Think about the last time you were absolutely certain about something. Not mildly confident. Certain. You knew you were right. You would have bet money on it. Maybe you did bet money on it. Or your reputation. Or a relationship. Or years of your career. Now ask yourself, how many times has that feeling of certainty been followed by the discovery that you were wrong? If you are being honest, the answer is not zero. It is not even rare. A 2019 study from the California Institute of Technology used brain imaging to examine what happens neurologically when people feel certain. The researchers discovered something that overturns everything we assume about confidence and accuracy. The feeling of certainty is generated in a completely different part of the brain than the processes that determine whether something is actually true. Your brain produces confidence independently of correctness. You can feel absolutely certain and be completely wrong. You can feel doubtful and be exactly right. The two systems do not even communicate with each other. Read that again. Your feeling of knowing has almost no relationship to whether you actually know. This is not a minor glitch. This is a fundamental design flaw in human cognition. And it explains why a room full of geniuses can make catastrophically stupid decisions while feeling entirely rational. Now let me make this personal. You have been in meetings where someone spoke with absolute confidence, and everyone nodded along. And later the confident person turned out to be completely wrong. You noticed it. You probably felt frustrated by it. You wondered how smart people could be so easily misled by mere confidence. But here is the question you did not ask. How many times have you been that confident person? How many times has your certainty convinced others to follow a direction that turned out to be flawed? How many times have people nodded along to your confident assertions without anyone stopping to ask whether the assertions were actually true? The answer is more than you want to admit. Not because you are dishonest or incompetent, because you are human. And human brains are not designed for accuracy. They are designed for efficiency, for speed, for pattern matching that works well enough to survive on ancient savannas but fails catastrophically in modern complexity. The difference between people who consistently make good decisions And people who wonder why things keep going wrong is not intelligence. It is not experience. It is not even information. It is a system, a specific, repeatable process for catching the errors that your brain generates automatically, invisibly, and with complete confidence that it is being rational. That system is what this book will give you. But before you can use it, you need to understand what you are actually fighting against. Let me introduce you to the 5 assassins that murder good judgment. The first assassin is confirmation bias. Right now, as you listen to these words, your brain is sorting information into 2 categories: things that support what you already believe and things that do not. The first category gets amplified, remembered, and treated as evidence. The second category gets minimized, forgotten, and treated as noise. You are not aware of this sorting. It happens automatically, and it means that every day, you are building a mental model of reality that is systematically distorted to confirm your existing views. Stanford researchers demonstrated this in an experiment that should haunt every professional who thinks they evaluate information objectively. They gave participants 2 studies on capital punishment. One suggested it deterred crime. One suggested it did not. Both studies were methodologically identical, but participants rated whichever study supported their existing view as more convincing, better designed, and more credible. When asked to explain their ratings, they produced sophisticated logical arguments for why their preferred study was superior. They were not lying. They genuinely believed their evaluation was objective. The bias operated below conscious awareness, shaping perception before analysis even began. The second assassin is anchoring. The first piece of information you receive on any topic becomes a reference point that distorts all subsequent judgment. In negotiations, whoever speaks first often controls the outcome, not through better arguments, but through setting an anchor that pulls all counteroffers toward it. In performance reviews, the first impression formed months ago shapes how every subsequent action is interpreted. In strategic planning, the first number mentioned becomes the gravitational center around which all other numbers orbit. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute demonstrated this with a terrifying experiment. They spun a random number wheel in front of participants, then asked them to estimate the percentage of African countries in the United Nations. The wheel had nothing to do with the question, but participants who saw a high number on the wheel gave estimates 30% higher than participants who saw a low number. A completely irrelevant random number reshaped their judgment about an unrelated fact. This is happening to you constantly. Every first impression, every initial data point, every opening offer is anchoring your subsequent thinking in ways you cannot detect. The third assassin is the availability heuristic. Your brain estimates probability and frequency based on how easily examples come to mind. If you can quickly think of instances where something happened, you assume it happens often. If examples are hard to recall, you assume it is rare. This sounds reasonable until you realize that ease of recall is determined by factors completely unrelated to actual frequency. Dramatic events are easier to recall than mundane ones. Recent events are easier to recall than distant ones. Events that happen to you personally are easier to recall than statistics about strangers. And events that received media coverage are easier to recall than events that did not. The result is systematic miscalibration. You overestimate the probability of plane crashes and underestimate the probability of car accidents. You overestimate the risk of dramatic failures and underestimate the risk of slow erosion. You overweight the vivid anecdote from a colleague and underweight the statistical analysis from a research team. A 2020 study from the Wharton School found that executives consistently misjudged market risks based on their personal experience rather than base rates. Those who had lived through a market crash early in their careers remained overly cautious decades later, even when conditions had fundamentally changed. Their available memories, not objective probabilities, drove decisions worth millions. The fourth assassin is the sunk cost fallacy. You continue investing in failing projects, deteriorating relationships, and dead-end strategies because of what you have already invested. The money already spent, the time already committed, the ego already attached. Rationally, past costs are irrelevant. Only future value matters. But your brain treats abandonment as waste and persistence as virtue, even when persistence guarantees greater loss. Harvard Business Review analyzed corporate project decisions and found that initiatives with high sunk costs were continued 41% longer than objectively justified, not by irrational people, by experienced executives at sophisticated companies. The emotional pain of acknowledging a loss overwhelmed the logical calculation of future returns. The fifth assassin is groupthink. The desire for harmony and conformity overrides realistic evaluation of alternatives. In groups, dissent feels dangerous. Disagreement feels disloyal. The pressure to align with the emerging consensus is so strong that people suppress their private doubts and convince themselves that their public agreement is genuine. The Bay of Pigs, the Challenger disaster, the Iraq War intelligence failures, Enron, the 2008 financial crisis. Each catastrophe was preceded by groups of intelligent people collectively ignoring warnings that individuals privately recognized. The group dynamic created blind spots that no individual would have maintained alone. These five assassins are operating in your life right now, in the beliefs you hold, the decisions you make, the information you accept and reject. They operate continuously, automatically, and without your awareness or consent. And here is what makes this so dangerous. The smarter you are, the more vulnerable you become. Because intelligence gives you better tools for constructing sophisticated justifications for conclusions you reached through biased processes. A 2013 study from the University of Toronto found that people with higher cognitive ability were more likely to fall for certain reasoning errors than people with lower cognitive ability. Their intelligence became a tool for eloquent self-deception rather than accurate analysis. You do not need more intelligence. You already have plenty. You do not need more information. The internet has given you infinite information, and most of it is making you worse at thinking, not better. What you need is a system. A specific, repeatable process for catching these assassins before they complete their work. A method for separating what feels true from what is true. A framework that works whether you are evaluating a business proposal, assessing a job offer, navigating a difficult relationship, or deciding what to believe about the world. That system has 7 steps. Each step is simple on its own. Together, they create a compound defense that transforms how you process information and make decisions. Step 1. Question the claim. Every piece of confident information that enters your awareness is a claim, not a fact, until examined. Step 2. Check the source. Not all sources deserve equal trust. Learn to evaluate credibility before your preferences contaminate your judgment. Step 3. Spot the bias. Know the patterns that distort human thinking and catch them in real time, in yourself and in others. Step 4. Test the logic. Persuasion and validity are different things. Learn to detect the structural flaws that make bad arguments sound compelling. Step 5. Demand evidence. Claims without evidence are hypotheses at best. Learn to distinguish genuine support from sophisticated assertion. Step 6. Separate emotion from data. Feelings are information, but they are not analysis. Learn to position emotion correctly in your decision process. Step 7. Decide with clarity. Analysis without action is expensive hesitation. Learn to reach clear conclusions under unavoidable uncertainty. These 7 steps will not make you smarter. They will make you effective. They will catch the errors that intelligence alone cannot prevent. They will protect you from the assassins that operate freely in undefended minds. The cost of not having this system is measured in years of career stagnation, relationships damaged by poor judgment, money lost to decisions that felt right but were not, and the quiet accumulation of a life shaped by errors you never saw happening. The benefit of having this system is clarity, the ability to see what others miss, to decide when others hesitate, to update when others defend, to be right more often not through luck or genius, but through disciplined process. Most people will finish this audiobook and do nothing differently. They will agree with the ideas, appreciate the framework, and continue operating exactly as before. The assassins will continue their work undetected. The errors will continue compounding. A small percentage will actually implement what they learn. They will practice the 7 steps until they become automatic. They will install the mental tripwires that catch distortions in real time. They will transform from people who occasionally think critically into people who cannot not think critically. The difference between these two groups has nothing to do with intelligence or opportunity. It has everything to do with a single decision made right now. Will you treat this as information to consume or a system to install? That decision is yours. But before you make it, understand what is at stake. Every major regret you carry traces back to a moment when you trusted the wrong conclusion, when you felt certain and were wrong, when the assassins did their work and you did not see it coming. You can continue that pattern, or you can end it. The next chapter reveals the complete 7-step system in detail. You will see exactly how each step works, when to apply it, and how the steps combine into a compound defense that protects your judgment from attacks you cannot even perceive. The choice to turn the page is simple. The consequences of that choice are not. Chapter 2. The 7-step system, your complete thinking framework. 11 seconds. That is how long an emergency room physician has to decide whether you live or die. Not 11 minutes. 11 seconds. In that sliver of time, they must process dozens of variables, filter out irrelevant noise, identify the critical signal, and commit to a course of action that cannot be undone. Get it right, and you walk out of the hospital. Get it wrong, and your family receives a phone call that changes everything. Yet somehow, the best emergency physicians maintain a 94% accuracy rate on critical decisions. Not because they are superhuman, not because they guess well, because they operate from a system so deeply installed that it functions faster than conscious thought. And in this chapter, you're going to learn that system. But first, let me show you what happens without one. In 2012, researchers at Johns Hopkins University published a study that sent shockwaves through the medical establishment. They calculated that medical errors were the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States, killing over 250,000 people every year. More than car accidents, more than diabetes, more than Alzheimer's. 250,000 people dead annually, not from diseases that could not be treated, but from mistakes in thinking made by trained professionals who believed they were being careful. The researchers did not blame incompetence. They blamed the absence of systematic thinking protocols. Doctors were making decisions the way most professionals make decisions, through intuition, experience, and pattern recognition that worked most of the time but failed catastrophically at critical moments. The 5 assassins from Chapter 1 were operating freely in hospitals, killing patients who trusted their physicians to think clearly. Then something changed. A surgeon named Atul Gawande, working with the World Health Organization, introduced a simple checklist protocol into operating rooms. The checklist was almost insultingly basic. Verify the patient's identity. Confirm the surgical site. Check for allergies. Review potential complications. Nothing on the list required medical school. A teenager could have followed it. And yet, when hospitals implemented this systematic protocol, surgical complications dropped by 36%. Deaths dropped by 47%. Tens of thousands of lives saved, not through new technology or breakthrough treatments, but through the simple act of replacing intuitive thinking with systematic thinking. This is the power you are about to acquire. The 7-step system I am going to teach you is not a medical checklist. It is more fundamental than that. It is a thinking protocol that works across every domain of decision-making: business strategy, career choices, relationship decisions, financial judgments, political evaluations. Any situation where you need to separate truth from noise and reach a clear conclusion. But I need to warn you about something before we proceed. This system will feel unnecessary at first. Your brain will resist it. You will encounter situations where you feel confident in your judgment, and the system will seem like wasted effort. This resistance is not a sign that you do not need the system. It is a sign that you desperately need it. Because the feeling of confidence is exactly what the 5 assassins exploit. They operate most effectively when you feel most certain. Remember the Wall Street executives from Chapter 1. They felt confident. Remember the doctors making fatal errors. They felt confident. Remember every catastrophic decision in your own life. At the moment you made it, You felt confident. The system exists precisely for those moments when your brain tells you a system is unnecessary. Now let me show you how it works. The 7 steps are not random. They are sequenced in a specific order that mirrors how information attacks your judgment and how defense must be mounted. Skip a step, and you leave a gap. Rearrange the order, and you create vulnerabilities. The sequence matters as much as the individual components. Here is the complete architecture. Step 1 is question the claim. Every piece of information that enters your awareness arrives disguised as a fact. Your colleague states that the client is unhappy. A headline declares a crisis. An expert asserts that the market will shift. A friend insists that a certain approach works. None of these are facts. They are claims. And the moment you treat a claim as a fact, you have already lost the first battle. The assassin operating at this stage is confirmation bias. Your brain sorts incoming claims based on whether they support what you already believe. Claims that confirm your existing views feel true and slide past without examination. Claims that contradict your views feel suspicious and trigger resistance. This sorting happens before conscious evaluation begins. By the time you think you are analyzing a claim, the verdict is already in. Step 1 breaks this pattern. Instead of unconsciously accepting or rejecting based on alignment with existing beliefs, you pause and ask a single question. What is this actually based on? Not whether you agree with the claim. Not whether the person making it seems credible. Not whether it feels right. Simply, what evidence or reasoning supports this assertion? This question shifts you from passive reception to active evaluation. It forces the claim to justify itself rather than riding in on the coattails of your existing beliefs. And it catches the most common error in professional thinking, building plans on foundations that no one ever examined. Step 2 is check the source. Not all sources deserve equal trust. A peer-reviewed study from a major research university carries different weight than an opinion piece from a blog. A first-hand account from someone who witnessed an event differs from a third-hand summary passed through multiple intermediaries. A statement from someone with relevant expertise means something different than a statement from someone who merely sounds confident. The assassin operating at this stage is the availability heuristic. Your brain judges source credibility based on how easily positive associations come to mind. If you have heard of the source before, it seems more credible. If the source has a prestigious-sounding name, it seems more credible. If the source confirms things you have previously accepted, it seems more credible. None of these associations relate to actual reliability. Step 2 installs a systematic check. You evaluate sources on 4 dimensions: expertise in the specific domain, independence from vested interests, track record of accuracy, and proximity to the primary information. This evaluation takes seconds once practiced, and it prevents you from weighting information based on surface impressions rather than structural credibility. Step 3 is spot the bias. You are biased. The person giving you information is biased. Everyone involved in generating, transmitting, and interpreting information is biased. This is not a moral failing. It is a feature of human cognition that becomes a bug in specific contexts. The assassins operating at this stage are all 5 simultaneously. Confirmation bias distorts what you notice. Anchoring distorts what you compare against. Availability distorts what you estimate. Sunk cost distorts what you value. Groupthink distorts what you consider acceptable to think. Step 3 does not eliminate bias. That is impossible. It installs tripwires that fire when bias patterns appear. When you notice yourself dismissing contradictory evidence without examination, the tripwire fires. When you notice a decision anchored on an arbitrary starting point, the tripwire fires. When you notice vivid anecdotes overriding statistical evidence, the tripwire fires. The tripwires do not prevent biased processing. They interrupt it before it completes. Step 4 is test the logic. An argument can be beautifully constructed, delivered with total confidence, and completely invalid. Persuasion and logical validity are different things. Your brain is wired to conflate them. Confident delivery feels like strong reasoning. Eloquent presentation feels like sound logic. This conflation is why the most dangerous arguments are often the most persuasive. The assassin operating at this stage is a meta-bias, the tendency to evaluate arguments based on how they feel rather than how they are structured. When an argument produces a feeling of agreement, you assume the logic must be sound. When an argument produces discomfort, you assume it must be flawed. The emotional response comes first. The logical evaluation follows, shaped to match. Step 4 reverses this sequence. You examine the structure of an argument independently of your emotional response to its conclusion. You ask, do the premises actually support this conclusion? Are there hidden assumptions bridging logical gaps? Is this argument valid even if I disagree with where it leads? This examination reveals the specific structural flaws that make bad arguments sound good. False dilemmas, appeals to authority, straw men, ad hominem attacks, slippery slopes, circular reasoning, and red herrings. Once you can identify these patterns, confident nonsense loses its power over you. Step 5 is demand evidence. Claims without evidence are hypotheses at best and manipulation at worst. Yet most professional conversations, most strategic discussions, and most important decisions proceed with almost no examination of evidentiary foundations. Someone states a claim confidently, others not. The claim becomes an accepted premise. Plans are built, resources are committed, and nobody ever asked the fundamental question: how do we actually know this is true? The assassin operating at this stage is anchoring combined with social proof. Once a claim is stated and appears to be accepted by others, it becomes anchored as a starting assumption. Questioning it feels like challenging the group consensus. So you stay silent, and the claim hardens into organizational truth without ever being tested. Step 5 makes evidence examination non-negotiable. When a claim is offered, you ask, what is this based on? If the answer is reasoning without data, you note that this is a hypothesis, not a fact. If the answer is data, you evaluate the quality of that data against a hierarchy. Systematic reviews at the top, randomized controlled trials below that, observational studies below that, case studies below that, and anecdotes at the bottom. This hierarchy gives you instant calibration. You know how much weight the evidence deserves. You can distinguish between claims that are well-supported and claims that merely sound well-supported. Step 6 is separate emotion from data. Emotions are essential to good decisions. Without them, you cannot evaluate what matters or motivate yourself to act. But emotions positioned incorrectly in the decision process transform from useful signals into dangerous distortions. The assassin operating at this stage is motivated reasoning. When you want a conclusion to be true, you apply stricter scrutiny to evidence against it and looser scrutiny to evidence for it. When you fear a conclusion might be true, you find reasons to dismiss it. Your emotional stake in the outcome biases your evaluation of the information, and you are not aware this is happening. You experience yourself as being objective. Step 6 creates separation between feeling and analysis. Before examining any decision, you conduct an emotional audit. You identify what you hope is true, what you fear might be true, and what is at stake for your ego or identity. By surfacing these influences explicitly, you reduce their power to distort invisibly. Then, during analysis, you deliberately set emotion aside and ask, what does the data show, independent of what I wanted to show? Finally, after analysis is complete, you allow emotion back in as a check. If the logical conclusion conflicts sharply with your gut response, that conflict is information worth investigating. But investigation comes before obedience. You examine what the feeling might be detecting rather than simply following it. Step 7 is decide with clarity. Analysis without action is expensive paralysis disguised as diligence. You can question claims, check sources, spot biases, test logic, demand evidence, and separate emotion from data. But if you never reach a conclusion, if you keep gathering more information and delaying commitment indefinitely, you have not thought critically. You have avoided thinking by hiding behind the appearance of thoroughness. The assassin operating at this stage is fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of commitment. Fear of consequences. This fear masquerades as prudence. It tells you that more analysis is needed, that certainty is achievable if you just work harder, that deciding now is reckless when deciding later might be safer. But perfect information never comes. Certainty is not available. And the cost of delayed decisions, missed opportunities, prolonged uncertainty, resources consumed in endless deliberation almost always exceeds the cost of imperfect decisions that can be adjusted as you learn. Step 7 forces clarity. You categorize decisions by reversibility. For reversible decisions, you bias towards speed. For irreversible decisions, you invest appropriately in analysis but set a deadline. You ask what you would need to know to decide, whether you can realistically obtain it, and what the cost of waiting is compared to the cost of being wrong. Then you decide. Not perfectly, not with certainty, but with clarity. That is the complete system. 7 steps. A specific sequence. A defense against each assassin. But knowing the steps is not the same as being able to use them. Let me show you what the system looks like in motion. Imagine you are evaluating a strategic recommendation from a consulting firm. They propose a major initiative that will require significant resources and commitment. You apply step 1. What is the actual claim being made? You force precision, not vague benefits, but specific outcomes with specific timelines. You apply step 2. What is the firm's track record? Have their previous recommendations produced results? What is their incentive structure? Do they benefit from you accepting this proposal? You apply step 3. What biases might be distorting this recommendation? Confirmation bias toward their methodology? Anchoring on early assumptions? What biases might be distorting your evaluation of it? You apply step 4. Does the logic hold? Does the proposed action actually lead to the predicted outcome? What assumptions bridge the gaps? Are there alternative explanations for the data they cite? You apply step 5. What evidence supports this? Are they citing case studies or systematic data? How comparable are their examples to your situation? What would constitute disconfirming evidence? You apply step 6. What do you want to be true here? Are you hoping this initiative will solve problems you are tired of facing? Are you afraid it might expose weaknesses in your current approach? How might those hopes and fears be shaping your evaluation? You apply step 7. Is this decision reversible? What is the cost of waiting versus proceeding? If you had to decide right now, what would you choose? This complete sequence might take an hour for a major decision. It might take 5 minutes for a smaller one. The investment scales to the stakes, but the structure remains constant. And every time you apply it, you strengthen the neural pathways that make systematic thinking automatic. Here is what separates the professionals who struggle from the professionals who excel. The average professional has knowledge without a system. They have read about biases, heard about logical fallacies, know that evidence matters. But when they encounter real decisions under real pressure, the knowledge stays abstract. They default to intuition. They trust confidence. They follow the group. The assassins complete their work uninterrupted. The elite professional has a system that overrides defaults. When information arrives, the system activates. Not through willpower, through habit. The steps fire automatically because they have been practiced until they became the natural way of processing important information. This is not about being more intelligent. It is about being more systematic. The chess grandmaster does not see a more beautiful board than the amateur. They see the same board through better trained pattern recognition. The emergency physician does not have faster neurons than the medical student. They have installed protocols that convert chaos into actionable clarity. You now have the complete map. 7 steps that protect against 5 assassins. A sequence that transforms raw information into defensible conclusions. But the map is not the territory. You need to understand each step deeply enough that it becomes part of how you see, not just something you remember to do. In Chapter 3, we begin the deep work. You will learn how to question claims in ways that reveal hidden assumptions without creating unnecessary conflict. You will discover why the question you ask determines the answer you get. And you will understand why the smartest people in the room are often asking the wrong questions entirely. The assassins are waiting for you to stop paying attention. Do not give them the opportunity. Chapter 3. Step 1. Question the claim. The most expensive meeting in corporate history lasted 14 minutes. On January 28, 1986, NASA engineers and Morton Thiokol executives held a teleconference about whether to launch the Space Shuttle Challenger the following morning. The temperature was forecast to drop below freezing. Engineers warned that the rubber O-ring seals had never been tested in such cold conditions. They recommended delaying the launch. But then something happened that changed everything. A manager asked the engineers to prove that the O-rings would fail. Not to prove they might fail. To prove they would fail. The engineers could not provide that level of certainty. So the launch proceeded. 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger exploded. 7 astronauts died. And the investigation that followed revealed a devastating truth. The real failure was not mechanical. It was cognitive. The wrong question was asked. Instead of asking, "Do we have evidence this is safe?" the decision-makers asked, "Do we have proof this is dangerous?" Those two questions sound similar. They are not. One places the burden of evidence where it belongs, on the claim that launching is acceptable. The other reverses the burden and demands certainty about disaster before allowing caution. This is why step 1 matters more than any other step in the system. The question you ask determines the answer you get. And most people, in most situations, ask the wrong question without realizing it. Let me show you what I mean. Every day, you encounter dozens of claims. Your colleague says the client is unhappy. A news headline declares a crisis. A manager insists that this quarter's numbers prove the strategy is working. A vendor promises their solution will increase efficiency by 30%. An expert on a podcast claims the market is about to shift. Your friend says they read that a certain food causes cancer. Notice what all of these have in common. They are presented as facts. But they are not facts. They are claims. And claims require a specific type of attention that facts do not. A fact is something verifiable and verified. The meeting is scheduled for Tuesday at 3 o'clock. The revenue last quarter was $4.2 million. The document has 12 pages. These are facts. You can check them against reality. A claim is an assertion that something is true. It may be true. It may be false. It may be partially true in some contexts and false in others. But until you examine it, you do not know. And the moment you treat a claim as a fact, you have made your first critical error. The average professional hears claims and sorts them unconsciously. Claims from people they trust get accepted. Claims from people they distrust get rejected. Claims that feel right get absorbed. Claims that feel wrong get dismissed. This sorting happens automatically, silently, and without any actual evaluation of whether the claim is true. The elite professional does something different. They hear a claim and they pause. Not for long, just long enough to ask one question. What is this based on? This question is the master key of critical thinking. It unlocks everything else. And it works because it shifts you from passive reception to active evaluation. When someone says the client is unhappy, and you ask, "What is that based on?" you might discover they spoke directly to the client and received specific complaints. That is meaningful information. Or you might discover they saw a terse email and assumed the worst. That is a very different situation. The claims sounded the same. The basis for the claim changes everything. Here is where most people make a mistake. They think questioning claims means being adversarial. They imagine themselves as the annoying person who challenges everything, slows down meetings, and makes others defensive. So they stay quiet. They accept claims to preserve harmony. And they make decisions based on unexamined assumptions. But questioning claims does not require confrontation. It requires curiosity. There is a profound difference between asking, "What is this based on?" with genuine interest and asking it with skeptical hostility. The words are identical. The tone changes everything. When you ask with curiosity, you are not attacking the speaker. You are trying to understand their reasoning. You are giving them an opportunity to share the evidence that supports their position. Most people appreciate this. It shows you are taking their claims seriously rather than nodding along without engagement. Let me give you a practical framework you can use starting today. When you hear a claim that matters, run it through 3 questions. First, what exactly is being claimed? Second, what would have to be true for this claim to be accurate? Third, what is this claim based on? The first question forces precision. Often, claims are vague. The project is behind schedule. Behind by how much? Behind on which deliverables? Behind compared to what baseline? Vague claims cannot be evaluated. You need specificity before you can assess. The second question reveals hidden assumptions. If someone claims a new strategy will increase revenue, what has to be true for that to work? Customers have to respond in a certain way. Competitors have to not respond in a certain way. Resources have to be allocated as planned. Market conditions have to remain stable. Every claim contains assumptions. Surfacing them shows you where the claim might break. The third question, what is this based on, connects the claim to its foundation. Is it based on data? What data? Is it based on experience? Whose experience? With what situations? Is it based on intuition? That is fine to acknowledge, but intuition is not evidence. It is a hypothesis that requires testing. A 2020 study from the Harvard Kennedy School examined decision-making in high-stakes environments. The researchers found that teams who systematically questioned initial claims before acting made 43% fewer consequential errors than teams who accepted claims and moved quickly to solutions. Speed felt efficient, but it was expensive. The time spent questioning saved far more time than it cost. Now let me address a concern you might have. What about situations where you cannot question openly? What about when the claim comes from your boss, or a client, or someone with authority over you? This is where internal questioning becomes essential. You do not always need to ask the question out loud. You can ask it in your own mind. When your CEO announces a strategic priority based on market analysis, you may not interrupt to demand sources. But you can mentally note, this is a claim. What might it be based on? And later, you can seek additional information to verify or challenge your understanding. Internal questioning keeps your mind in evaluation mode rather than acceptance mode. It prevents you from building plans on unexamined foundations. Even when you cannot voice your questions, you can ensure that you are not lying to yourself about what you actually know. Here is another technique that works in professional settings without creating friction. Instead of asking, what is that based on directly, you can ask, can you help me understand the background here? This invites the speaker to share their reasoning without feeling challenged. You can also say, I want to make sure I am following the logic, or what led you to that conclusion. These phrasings signal collaboration rather than confrontation. The goal is never to win an argument. The goal is to see clearly. And clear seeing requires understanding not just what someone believes, but why they believe it. Let me give you an example of how this works in practice. Imagine you are evaluating a proposal from a consulting firm. They claim their methodology will reduce your operational costs by 25% within 18 months. The claim is specific. The number sounds impressive. The presentation is polished. Most people in the room are nodding. You ask yourself, what is this claim based on? You discover they are citing results from 3 previous clients. That sounds like evidence, but you dig slightly deeper. Were those clients in your industry? Were they similar in size and complexity? Were there other factors that contributed to their cost reduction? Did the consulting firm measure the results? Or did the client self-report? Suddenly the claim looks different. Not necessarily false, but less certain than it first appeared. And that changes how you think about the decision. The average decision maker would take the 25% figure and build projections around it. They would calculate ROI, make commitments, and set expectations based on that number. If the number turns out to be optimistic, everything downstream breaks. The elite decision maker treats the number as a claim to be examined. They ask clarifying questions. They look for comparable evidence. They adjust their confidence level based on the quality of the foundation. And they make a decision that accounts for uncertainty rather than ignoring it. This is the power of step 1. It costs almost nothing. A few seconds of mental discipline. A few questions asked with genuine curiosity. But it prevents the most common and most expensive errors, the errors that come from building on unexamined foundations. There is one more element I want you to understand before we move to step 2. Not all claims deserve equal scrutiny. If someone tells you the coffee machine is broken, you do not need to launch an investigation. If someone tells you the company should pursue a multi-million-dollar acquisition, you need serious examination. The principle is proportionality. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary scrutiny. Routine claims require routine verification. The skill is calibrating your questioning to the stakes involved. In Chapter 4, you will learn how to evaluate the sources behind claims. Because once you have identified that something is a claim and asked what it is based on, the next question is, How reliable is that source? A claim from a rigorous study means something different than a claim from a single anecdote. A claim from someone with direct knowledge differs from a claim passed through three intermediaries. The source changes everything, and most people never think to check. You now have step 1 fully installed. Question the claim. Ask what it is based on. Seek precision, surface assumptions, and connect assertions to their foundations. Do this with curiosity rather than hostility. Calibrate your scrutiny to the stakes. This single habit, practiced consistently, will prevent more errors than most people experience in a lifetime. But it is only the beginning. The source filter is next. Chapter 4. Step 2. Check the source. In 2018, a study appeared to prove that chocolate helps you lose weight. Major news outlets covered it. The story spread across social media. Millions of people saw the headline and adjusted their beliefs accordingly. There was just one problem. The study was fake. A journalist named John Bohannon had deliberately designed a flawed experiment, submitted it to a predatory journal that published anything for a fee, and watched as the media machine amplified nonsense into apparent fact. His goal was to expose how easily bad information spreads when no one checks the source. He succeeded beyond his expectations. And the lesson should disturb you. Because if professional journalists at major publications failed to verify a source before broadcasting it to millions, what chance does the average person have? The answer is a much better chance than you might think. But only if you have a system. Checking sources sounds tedious. It sounds like something librarians do. It sounds like extra work that slows you down when you need to make decisions quickly. And that perception is exactly why most people skip this step. They hear something from someone who sounds credible, and they move on. They read something on a website that looks professional, and they accept it. They receive information from a colleague they trust, and they build on it without verification. This is not laziness. This is how human brains are designed to operate. We are wired to use credibility shortcuts. If the messenger seems trustworthy, we trust the message. If the platform looks legitimate, we assume the content is legitimate. If the information comes through someone we know, we treat it as more reliable than information from strangers. These shortcuts work most of the time. That is why they evolved. But in a world where anyone can publish anything, where misinformation is engineered to look credible, and where even well-meaning sources make mistakes, the shortcuts fail more often than we realize. Step 2 gives you a rapid system for evaluating sources without becoming paralyzed by verification procedures. You will learn to assess credibility in seconds, not hours. And you will develop an instinct for when to dig deeper and when surface-level checking is sufficient. Let me give you the core framework first. Then we will break down each element. Every source can be evaluated on 4 dimensions: expertise, independence, track record, and proximity. Expertise asks, does this source have relevant knowledge or credentials in this specific domain? A brilliant physicist is not automatically credible on economics. A successful CEO is not automatically credible on epidemiology. Expertise is domain-specific. And the most common source error is assuming that credibility in one area transfers to credibility in all areas. A 2019 study from the Stanford History Education Group tested students' ability to evaluate online sources. The results were alarming. 82% of students could not distinguish between a news story and a sponsored advertisement. 96% failed to consider why a source might be biased. And the vast majority never checked whether a cited expert actually had expertise in the relevant domain. These were not unintelligent students. They simply lacked a systematic approach to source evaluation. When you encounter a source making a claim, your first question should be, what qualifies this source to make this specific claim? Not in general, in this specific domain. A doctor speaking about medicine has relevant expertise. A doctor speaking about investment strategy does not, unless they have separate credentials in finance. The second dimension is independence. Does this source have a stake in what they are telling you? This does not mean that interested parties are always wrong. A pharmaceutical company can produce accurate research about its own drugs. A salesperson can tell you the truth about their product. But independence affects how you weight the information. A study funded by the sugar industry claiming sugar is harmless deserves more scrutiny than an independent study reaching the same conclusion. The claim might be identical. The source reliability is not. In 2016, researchers at the University of California, San Francisco uncovered documents showing that the sugar industry had paid scientists in the 1960s to downplay the link between sugar and heart disease, shifting blame to dietary fat instead. The research was published in major journals. The scientists had genuine credentials, but the funding source created incentives that distorted the conclusions. Decades of nutritional guidance were influenced by source bias that no one thought to check. When evaluating independence, ask, who benefits if I believe this? If the source benefits directly from your acceptance, increase your scrutiny. Not your rejection, your scrutiny. The claim might still be true, but you need additional verification. The third dimension is track record. Has this source been reliable in the past? This is where pattern recognition becomes valuable. A publication that has repeatedly corrected major errors deserves less automatic trust than one with a strong accuracy record. A colleague who has given you bad information before should trigger more verification than one who has been consistently reliable. An expert who predicted events correctly has more credibility on future predictions than one whose forecasts have failed. Track record is not about perfection. Everyone makes mistakes. But consistent patterns reveal something about methodology, rigor, and intellectual honesty. Someone who acknowledges errors and corrects them demonstrates more reliability than someone who never admits being wrong. Because the second pattern usually means errors are hidden rather than absent. The fourth dimension is proximity. How close is this source to the actual information? There is a massive difference between primary sources and secondary sources. A primary source has direct access to the information. They witnessed the event, conducted the study, or possess first-hand knowledge. A secondary source is reporting what someone else said, summarizing research they did not conduct, or describing events they did not witness. This matters because information degrades with each transmission. The original researcher knows the caveats and limitations of their study. The journalist summarizing it might miss crucial nuances. The social media post summarizing the article, summarizing the study, might invert the meaning entirely. By the time information has passed through 3 or 4 intermediaries, it often bears little resemblance to the original. When possible, get closer to primary sources. Read the actual study, not just the headline about the study. Talk to the person who was present, not just someone who heard about it. The closer you get to the origin, the more accurate your understanding becomes. Now let me show you how to apply these 4 dimensions quickly in real situations. Imagine you receive an article from a colleague claiming that remote work reduces productivity by 15%. Before you adjust your beliefs or share this with others, run through the source check. Expertise. Who conducted this research? Is it from organizational psychologists or labor economists who study workplace dynamics? Or is it from a commercial real estate firm with obvious interest in people returning to offices? Independence. Who funded the study? Who published it? Does the source have financial or ideological stake in the conclusion? Track record. Is this publication or researcher known for rigorous work? Have their previous claims held up? Or do they have a pattern of sensational findings that later failed to replicate? Proximity. Is this the original research or a summary of a summary? Can you access the actual methodology, sample size, and limitations? This entire evaluation can happen in 60 seconds. You are not conducting a full investigation. You are calibrating how much weight to give the information. A claim that passes all 4 filters deserves more confidence than a claim that fails on multiple dimensions. Here is where the elite thinker differs from the average thinker. The average thinker evaluates sources based on surface signals. Does it look professional? Does it sound confident? Does the person seem smart? These signals are easy to fake. A well-designed website costs a few $100s. A confident tone can be adopted by anyone. Intelligence in one domain does not guarantee accuracy in another. The elite thinker evaluates sources based on structural signals. What is the actual expertise? What are the incentive structures? What does the track record reveal? How close is this to the primary information? These signals are harder to fake and more predictive of reliability. Let me give you one more tool that dramatically improves source evaluation. When you encounter a claim from a single source, your confidence should be moderate at best. When you encounter the same claim from multiple independent sources with different methodologies and incentives, your confidence can increase substantially. This is called triangulation, and it is one of the most powerful verification techniques available. If one study suggests that a certain management practice improves performance, that is interesting but preliminary. If 5 studies from different research teams in different countries using different methods all converge on the same finding, that is much stronger evidence. The probability that 5 independent groups all made the same error is far lower than the probability that one group made an error. Similarly, if a news story appears in a single outlet, approach it with caution. If the same story is independently confirmed by multiple outlets with separate reporting, your confidence can increase. The key word is independent. 5 outlets, all citing the same original source, is not triangulation. It is amplification of a single data point. There is a practical reality I need to address. You cannot thoroughly vet every source for every claim you encounter. You would never finish reading anything. You would never make any decisions. The goal is not perfect verification. The goal is proportional verification. For low-stakes claims, a quick mental check is sufficient. Does this source seem plausible? Is there any obvious red flag? If not, you can provisionally accept the claim while remaining open to revision. For high-stakes claims, invest more in verification. Check the expertise directly. Look for independence issues. Examine track record. Seek primary sources. Triangulate with additional sources. The calibration question is simple. What is the cost of being wrong? If the cost is low, quick verification is appropriate. If the cost is high, thorough verification is required. Before we move to step 3, I want to leave you with a mindset shift that transforms how you consume information. Most people think of themselves as passive receivers of information. The news tells them things. Experts inform them. Sources deliver knowledge. This framing makes you vulnerable. It puts the responsibility for accuracy on others. And as we have seen, others frequently fail that responsibility, sometimes through error, sometimes through incentive, sometimes through deliberate deception. The elite thinker adopts a different frame. They see themselves as active evaluators of information. Every claim is an input to be processed, not a truth to be absorbed. Every source is a witness to be assessed, not an authority to be trusted blindly. This shift does not make you cynical. It makes you calibrated. You can still trust sources. You simply trust them in proportion to their demonstrated reliability. You now have step 2 installed. When you encounter a claim, you question it. Then you check the source. Expertise, independence, track record, proximity. For dimensions that reveal how much weight the information deserves. But even reliable sources can deliver distorted information, because the source might be accurate about facts while completely blind to how those facts are being filtered through cognitive biases. In Chapter 5, you will learn to spot the invisible distortions that affect even the most credible sources, including the ones operating inside your own mind right now. Chapter 5, Step 3, Spot the bias. Right now, as you listen to this sentence, at least 7 cognitive biases are operating in your brain. You cannot feel them. You did not choose them. And unless you know exactly what to look for, they will shape your next decision without your awareness or consent. This is not a metaphor. This is neuroscience. And the most unsettling part is this. The smarter you are, the more sophisticated your biases become at hiding from you. In 1972, psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman began a research program that would eventually earn Kahneman a Nobel Prize and fundamentally change how we understand human judgment. Their core discovery was simple but devastating. Human beings are not rational actors who occasionally make emotional mistakes. We are emotional actors who occasionally achieve rationality. Our brains are running software that was optimized for survival on ancient savannas, not for accuracy in modern boardrooms. And that software contains bugs. Predictable, systematic, documentable bugs that distort perception in consistent patterns. These bugs are cognitive biases, and in this chapter, you will learn to see them, not just intellectually, not just as interesting concepts to discuss at dinner parties. You will develop the ability to catch biases in real time, in yourself and in others, before they corrupt your decisions. This is the skill that separates people who know about biases from people who actually overcome them. Let me start by destroying a common illusion. Most people believe they are less biased than average. In surveys conducted across dozens of countries, the vast majority of respondents rate themselves as more objective, more rational, and more fair-minded than their peers. Mathematically, this is impossible. Most people cannot be above average. But the belief persists because it is itself produced by a bias. Psychologists call this the bias blind spot. We are remarkably skilled at detecting flawed thinking in others while remaining oblivious to identical patterns in ourselves. A 2015 study from Carnegie Mellon University found that people who scored highest on cognitive ability tests showed the strongest bias blind spots. Their intelligence gave them more tools to rationalize their own objectivity while critiquing others. This is the first thing you must accept. You are biased, not occasionally, continuously, not in some areas, in all areas. The question is not whether bias affects you. The question is which biases are affecting you right now and what you will do about it. Let me give you the 5 biases that cause the most damage in professional decision-making. These are not obscure psychological curiosities. These are the silent killers of good judgment that operate in meetings, negotiations, and strategic choices every single day. The first is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information that confirms what you already believe while ignoring or dismissing information that contradicts it. Here is how it works in practice. You form an initial opinion about a colleague's competence. From that moment forward, you notice every mistake they make and remember it vividly. Their successes blur together or get attributed to luck or help from others. A year later, you have accumulated a mountain of evidence that confirms your initial judgment. But the mountain is manufactured. You filtered reality to match your expectation, then used the filtered evidence to justify the expectation. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology demonstrated that confirmation bias affects even trained scientists evaluating research in their own fields. When participants reviewed studies that contradicted their theoretical positions, they found more methodological flaws. When they reviewed studies supporting their positions, they accepted weaker methodology. The bias operated below conscious awareness. The scientists genuinely believed they were being objective. The practical antidote is deliberate disconfirmation. When you form a hypothesis, actively seek evidence that would prove you wrong. Ask yourself, what would I expect to see if my belief were false? Then look for that specific evidence. If you find it, update. If you genuinely cannot find it despite searching, your confidence can increase legitimately. The second bias is anchoring. Anchoring is the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information you receive, using it as a reference point for all subsequent judgments. In a famous experiment, Tversky and Kahneman spun a wheel of fortune in front of participants. The wheel was rigged to land on either 10 or 65. Then they asked participants to estimate what percentage of United Nations countries were African. The number from the wheel had nothing to do with the question. But participants who saw 10 guessed around 25%. Participants who saw 65 guessed around 45%. A completely random number shaped their estimates of an unrelated fact. This happens constantly in professional settings. The first budget number mentioned becomes the anchor for all negotiation. The first performance rating shapes all subsequent evaluations. The first price quoted defines what seems reasonable. Whoever sets the anchor shapes the conversation, often without anyone realizing it. The practical antidote is anchor awareness. When you notice yourself using a reference point, ask, where did this reference come from? Is it actually relevant? What would my estimate be if I started from scratch? Generating your own independent estimate before being exposed to anchors significantly reduces their power. The third bias is the availability heuristic. The availability heuristic causes you to overweight information that comes to mind easily, usually because it is recent, vivid, or emotionally charged. After a plane crash receives extensive media coverage, people overestimate the danger of flying even though statistically, their drive to the airport is far more dangerous than the flight. After a colleague makes a memorable mistake, you overestimate their error rate. After a successful product launch that you personally witnessed, you overestimate the probability of similar success in the future. Your brain uses ease of recall as a proxy for frequency and probability. If you can quickly think of examples, you assume the category is large or the event is common. But ease of recall is influenced by factors unrelated to actual frequency. Media coverage, emotional intensity, and personal involvement all make things more available without making them more common. A 2020 study from the Wharton School examined investment decisions among fund managers. Those who had personally experienced a market crash early in their careers consistently underweight risk in stable periods and overweight risk after volatility, regardless of statistical base rates. Their available memories, not objective probabilities, drove their choices. The practical antidote is base rate attention. When estimating probability or frequency, deliberately seek statistical data rather than relying on examples that come to mind. Ask, what does the actual data show, independent of what I can easily remember? The fourth bias is the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to continue investing in something because of what you have already invested, even when future returns do not justify continued investment. You stay in a failing project because you have already spent 6 months on it. You finish a bad book because you already read half of it. You hold a losing stock because selling would mean admitting the loss. You continue a relationship that makes you miserable because you have already invested years. Economically, this makes no sense. Past costs are gone. They cannot be recovered. The only rational question is, given where I am now, what is the best path forward? But psychologically, abandoning an investment feels like waste. So we throw good resources after bad, compounding losses to avoid acknowledging them. A 2017 analysis from the Harvard Business Review examined corporate project decisions. They found that projects with high sunk costs were continued 41% longer than objectively justified, resulting in massive resource waste. The executives making these decisions were experienced, intelligent, and well-intentioned. They simply could not separate past investment from future value. The practical antidote is the fresh start test. Ask yourself, if I were starting today with no prior investment, would I choose this path? If the answer is no, the sunk costs are distorting your judgment. What you have spent is irrelevant. Only future value matters. The fifth bias is groupthink. Groupthink occurs when the desire for conformity and harmony in a group overrides realistic evaluation of alternatives. In a groupthink environment, dissent feels dangerous. People self-censor to avoid disrupting consensus. Warnings get softened or suppressed. The group develops an illusion of invulnerability and unanimous agreement that does not reflect individual members' private doubts. The Bay of Pigs invasion, the Challenger disaster, the Enron collapse, the 2008 financial crisis. Each of these catastrophes involved intelligent people in groups who collectively ignored warnings that individuals privately recognized. The group dynamic created blind spots that no individual would have maintained alone. A 2021 study in the journal Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes found that groupthink was strongest in teams with high cohesion and directive leadership. The more people liked each other and respected their leader, the less willing they were to voice disagreement. The very factors that make teams feel good undermine their ability to think critically. The practical antidote is structured dissent. Before major decisions, formally assign someone to argue the opposite position. Explicitly invite criticism. Ask each person to write their concerns privately before group discussion. Make disagreement safe by praising it rather than punishing it. Now let me show you how to apply bias detection in real time. The average thinker knows about biases as concepts. They might even be able to define them. But in the moment of decision, the knowledge stays abstract. It does not interrupt the bias processing as it happens. The biases operate freely while the knowledge sits unused. The elite thinker has installed tripwires, specific mental triggers that fire when bias patterns appear. When you notice yourself dismissing contradicting evidence, a tripwire fires. Confirmation bias. Pause and examine. When you notice a negotiation revolving around an initial number, a tripwire fires. Anchoring. Generate independent estimates. When you notice yourself citing vivid examples rather than data, a tripwire fires. Availability heuristic. Seek base rates. When you notice reluctance to abandon something because of prior investment, a tripwire fires. Sunk cost fallacy. Apply the fresh start test. When you notice a group converging quickly without dissent, a tripwire fires. Groupthink. Invite explicit disagreement. These tripwires must be installed through practice. You cannot simply read about them and expect activation. You must deliberately watch for the patterns repeatedly until recognition becomes automatic. This takes weeks, not minutes. But once installed, the tripwires operate continuously, catching biases before they complete their damage. Here is an exercise you can start today. For the next week, at the end of each day, review one significant decision or judgment you made. Ask yourself, which of the 5 biases might have influenced this? Not which definitely influenced it. Which might have. You will not always find a bias. Sometimes your thinking was clean, but the practice of looking builds the recognition patterns that eventually fire in real time. There is something else you need to understand about biases. They do not operate in isolation. They stack. They combine. They amplify each other. Confirmation bias feeds the availability heuristic, which strengthens anchoring, which makes sunk cost fallacies more likely. A single decision can be distorted by multiple biases simultaneously, each one invisible, each one pushing toward the same error. This is why a systematic approach matters. Checking for one bias is helpful, but checking systematically for the patterns that commonly distort your specific type of decision is transformative. You now have step 3 installed. You know the 5 highest impact biases. You understand how they operate. You have practical antidotes for each. And you have a method for building real-time detection through tripwire installation. But biases are not the only invisible distortions in your thinking. Even after you account for bias, the logical structure of your reasoning can contain fatal flaws. An argument can feel compelling, sound intelligent, and still be completely invalid. In Chapter 6, you will learn to detect the logical fallacies that make bad arguments sound persuasive. And you will finally understand why some of the most confident people you know are consistently wrong. Chapter 6, Step 4. Test the logic. The most persuasive argument you have ever heard was probably wrong. Not because the speaker was lying, not because they lacked intelligence, but because persuasion and validity are completely different things. An argument can be beautifully constructed, emotionally compelling, delivered with absolute conviction, and still be logically broken at its foundation. This is the uncomfortable truth that most people never learn. Feeling convinced tells you nothing about whether you should be convinced. In 1979, researchers at Stanford University conducted an experiment that should trouble anyone who trusts their own judgment. They gave participants 2 studies about the death penalty. One study suggested it deterred crime. The other suggested it did not. The studies were fabricated, designed to be equally strong methodologically. But here's what happened. Participants who supported the death penalty rated the pro-deterrence study as more convincing and better conducted. Participants who opposed it rated the anti-deterrence study as more convincing. When asked to explain their evaluations, both groups produced sophisticated logical arguments for why their preferred study was superior. The arguments sounded rigorous. They felt rational. They were completely contaminated by motivated reasoning dressed up as logic. This is the challenge you face every day. Your brain generates logical-sounding justifications for conclusions you have already reached emotionally. Other people's brains do the same thing when trying to persuade you. The result is a world filled with confident arguments that fail basic logical tests, delivered by intelligent people who genuinely believe they are being rational. Step 4 gives you the tools to see through the illusion. You will learn to identify the specific structural flaws that make arguments invalid, regardless of how compelling they feel. And you will develop the skill that truly sophisticated thinkers possess: the ability to separate the experience of being persuaded from the reality of sound reasoning. Let me begin with a fundamental distinction. An argument has two components: premises and conclusions. Premises are the claims offered as support. Conclusions are what supposedly follows from those premises. A valid argument is one where the conclusion actually follows from the premises. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. An invalid argument is one where the conclusion does not follow, even if the premises are true. Here is the critical insight. You can have true premises and a false conclusion if the logical structure is broken. And you can have a valid logical structure built on false premises, which gives you a false conclusion through impeccable reasoning. Both failures look different. Both are fatal. The average thinker evaluates arguments by asking, does this feel right? Does the conclusion match what I already believe? Does the speaker seem credible? The elite thinker evaluates arguments by asking, do the premises actually support this conclusion? What logical structure connects them? Are there hidden gaps or leaps? This difference in approach produces dramatically different outcomes over time. Let me show you the 7 logical fallacies that cause the most damage in professional settings. The first is the false dilemma. A false dilemma presents only 2 options when more exist. Either we launch this product now, or we lose the market forever. Either you are with us, or you are against us. Either we cut costs, or we go bankrupt. This fallacy works because it simplifies complex situations into binary choices, creating artificial urgency and eliminating nuance. The pressure to choose between 2 options prevents examination of the third, fourth, or fifth options that might actually be superior. A 2018 study from INSEAD Business School analyzed strategic decisions in Fortune 500 companies. They found that 34% of major strategic failures involved false dilemma framing at the decision point. Leaders presented binary choices to their boards for closing options that post-mortem analysis revealed were available and preferable. The antidote is simple but powerful. When presented with 2 options, ask, what is option 3? Force yourself to generate alternatives. The mere act of looking for additional options often reveals them. And if someone resists exploring alternatives, that resistance itself is informative. The second fallacy is the appeal to authority. An appeal to authority substitutes credentials for evidence. The CEO believes this will work. The expert said this is true. The study from a prestigious university confirmed this. Authority can be useful as a heuristic. Experts are more likely to be right in their domain than non-experts. But authority is not evidence. Experts can be wrong. Prestigious institutions produce flawed research, and credentials in one domain do not transfer to another. The problem becomes severe when authority is used to shut down questioning rather than to inform it. When someone says, the expert already settled this, they are using authority to prevent evaluation rather than to contribute to it. The antidote is to treat authority as a starting point, not an ending point. Ask, what is the actual argument or evidence behind the authority's position? If the expert is right, there should be reasons they are right. Those reasons are what matter, not the credentials. The third fallacy is the straw man. A straw man attack misrepresents someone's position, making it easier to defeat. Instead of engaging with the actual argument, the attacker substitutes a weaker or more extreme version, demolishes that, and claims victory. You suggest exploring a new market. Your opponent responds, so you want us to abandon our core customers and gamble everything on an unproven strategy? That is not what you said. But now you are defending against a position you never took. Straw man arguments are devastatingly effective in meetings because correcting them takes time and makes you look defensive. By the time you clarify what you actually meant, the conversation has moved on, and the distorted version of your position lingers in people's minds. The antidote is immediate correction with precision. When you detect a straw man, respond, that is not my position. My actual position is this. State it clearly and simply. Then invite engagement with what you actually said, not the distortion. The fourth fallacy is ad hominem. Ad hominem attacks the person making the argument rather than the argument itself. He has no experience in this industry. She has a personal agenda. They said something wrong 3 years ago. These attacks can be relevant if they genuinely affect credibility. But more often, they are used to avoid engaging with arguments that are difficult to refute. If I cannot defeat your logic, I will defeat you instead. A 2020 analysis in the Journal of Applied Psychology examined how ad hominem attacks affected group decisions. When a valid argument was paired with an ad hominem attack on its source, groups were 47% less likely to adopt the argument, even when its logical validity was independently confirmed. The attack worked not by refuting the logic, but by contaminating the messenger. The antidote is refocusing on the argument. When you observe an ad hominem attack, ask, but what about the actual point being made? Is the argument valid regardless of who is making it? Separate the logic from the source. The fifth fallacy is the slippery slope. A slippery slope argues that one step inevitably leads to extreme consequences, without demonstrating why the intermediate steps are actually inevitable. If we allow flexible work hours, soon no one will come to the office. If we make one exception to this policy, the entire policy becomes meaningless. If we compromise on this issue, we will have to compromise on everything. Slippery slopes work by triggering fear of extreme outcomes. But the logic depends on each step in the chain being inevitable. Usually, it is not. There are stopping points, moderating factors, and decision points along the way that the argument ignores. The antidote is to examine the chain. Ask, why is each step inevitable? What would prevent us from stopping at an intermediate point? If the answer is nothing would actually prevent that, the slippery slope is an illusion. The sixth fallacy is circular reasoning. Circular reasoning uses the conclusion as a premise. It assumes what it is trying to prove. This strategy works because I am confident it will work. He is trustworthy because I trust him. This is the right decision because it is what we decided. Circular arguments often hide in more complex structures, making them harder to detect. The conclusion is stated at the beginning, supporting arguments are offered, and then the conclusion reappears disguised as a final premise. It feels like a complete chain of reasoning, but it is actually a loop. The antidote is to trace the chain. For any argument, ask, if I remove the conclusion entirely, do the premises still provide independent support? If the premises require the conclusion to be true in order to make sense, you have found circular reasoning. The seventh fallacy is the red herring. A red herring diverts attention from the actual issue to something irrelevant. When the real question becomes uncomfortable, a new topic appears that is easier to discuss. You raise concerns about a project's timeline. The response addresses how hard the team is working. You question the accuracy of a report. The response emphasizes how much effort went into producing it. Effort and timelines are different questions. Effort and accuracy are different questions. But the diversion feels like a response. Red herrings exploit the conversational norm that responses should be relevant. When someone offers what sounds like a response, we tend to accept it as addressing our point, even when it does not. The antidote is explicit refocusing. When you detect a red herring, respond, I appreciate that point, but it does not address my question. My question was this. Repeat your original concern and request a direct response. Now let me give you a framework for applying fallacy detection in real time. When you encounter an argument, especially one that feels compelling or that you want to agree with, run it through a quick structural test. Ask 3 questions. First, what are the actual premises and what is the conclusion? State them explicitly, even if only in your mind. This often reveals gaps that were hidden by eloquent delivery. Second, if the premises are true, does the conclusion necessarily follow? Or is there a logical leap, a missing step, an assumption bridging the gap? Third, which of the 7 fallacies might be present? Scan for false dilemmas, authority substitution, straw men, ad hominem attacks, slippery slopes, circular reasoning, and red herrings. This scan takes seconds once practiced, and it fundamentally changes your relationship with persuasion. Instead of being swept along by compelling delivery, you maintain a structural awareness that catches errors before they become your errors. Here is a truth that might be uncomfortable. The people who use logical fallacies most effectively are often not trying to deceive you. They are deceiving themselves. They have convinced themselves through the same flawed reasoning they are now sharing with you. Their confidence is genuine. Their persuasion is sincere. And their logic is still broken. This means you cannot use intent to detect fallacies. Good people with honest intentions produce invalid arguments constantly. The only reliable detection method is structural analysis. Examine the logic, not the person. There is one more element to consider. Your own arguments contain fallacies too. Everyone's do. The same skill you are developing to evaluate others' reasoning applies to your own. Before you present an argument, run it through the same tests. What are my premises? Does my conclusion actually follow? Am I using any of the 7 fallacies? This self-examination is uncomfortable. It is much easier to find flaws in others than in yourself. But it is also where the greatest improvement happens. An argument you have already stress-tested is far more likely to survive scrutiny than one you have only experienced as compelling from the inside. The average professional learns to make their arguments sound persuasive. The elite professional learns to make their arguments actually valid, knowing that persuasive and valid are not the same thing. Over time, this difference compounds. The person with valid arguments builds credibility. The person with merely persuasive arguments eventually gets caught. You now have step 4 installed. You can identify the 7 most common logical fallacies. You have a 3-question framework for real-time structural analysis. And you understand that persuasion and validity require completely different evaluation methods. But valid logic built on false premises still produces false conclusions. The structure can be perfect while the foundation is rotten. This is why step 5 is essential. In the next chapter, you will learn how to demand and evaluate evidence. Because when someone tells you their premises are true, the critical question becomes, how do you know? Chapter 7, Step 5, Demand evidence. 89% of business decisions are made with what executives privately admit is insufficient evidence. Not wrong evidence. Not misleading evidence. Simply not enough evidence to justify the confidence level behind the decision. This finding comes from a 2022 study by McKinsey's Organizational Research Division, and it should stop you cold. Because if you have ever sat in a meeting where important choices were made based on compelling arguments and confident assertions, you were probably watching this pattern unfold in real time. The logic sounded good. The people seemed credible. The direction felt right. And nobody asked the question that separates rigorous thinking from expensive hope. That question is, what is the evidence? Not what is the argument. Not what is the reasoning. Not what do we believe. What is the actual evidence that this claim is true? This single question, asked consistently, will save you from more bad decisions than any other tool in your thinking arsenal. And in this chapter, you will learn exactly how to ask it, how to evaluate the answers you receive, and how to distinguish evidence that deserves your trust from evidence that merely sounds trustworthy. Let me start with a distinction that most people never make. There is a difference between reasons and evidence. Reasons are arguments for why something might be true. Evidence is data that demonstrates it is true. You can have excellent reasons with no evidence. And you can have evidence that contradicts excellent reasons. Here is an example. Someone argues that a new marketing strategy will increase sales. Their reasons are sophisticated. The target demographic is underserved. Competitors have not exploited this channel, and the timing aligns with market trends. These are good reasons. They make the conclusion plausible, but they are not evidence. They are predictions based on analysis. Evidence would be, we tested this strategy in 3 markets and saw a 23% increase in conversion rates. That is data. That is something that actually happened in reality. It can be examined, verified, and potentially replicated. The average thinker treats strong reasons as if they were evidence. The argument sounds good, so it must be right. The logic is coherent, so the conclusion is probably true. The elite thinker recognizes that reasons are hypotheses and evidence is testing. Until a claim has been tested against reality, it remains speculation, no matter how sophisticated the reasoning behind it. Now let me give you an evidence hierarchy that transforms how you evaluate information. Not all evidence is equal. A controlled experiment is not the same as an anecdote. A systematic review is not the same as a single study. Understanding this hierarchy allows you to calibrate your confidence appropriately. At the top of the hierarchy sits systematic reviews and meta-analyses. These combine multiple studies, weigh their methodologies, and synthesize conclusions across the entire body of research. When a meta-analysis of 40 studies reaches a conclusion, that conclusion deserves substantially more weight than any single study alone. The probability that 40 independent studies all made the same error is far lower than the probability that one study made an error. Below that sits randomized controlled trials. These are experiments where participants are randomly assigned to conditions, allowing researchers to isolate cause and effect. When a randomized controlled trial shows that intervention X produces outcome Y, you have strong evidence of a causal relationship. The randomization controls for confounding variables that might otherwise explain the result. Below that sits observational studies. These examine correlations in existing data without experimental manipulation. Observational studies can show that two things occur together, but they cannot definitively establish that one causes the other. This is the domain where most business research operates, and where caution is most necessary. Below that sits case studies and expert opinion. A detailed examination of one situation or the judgment of someone with experience can provide useful hypotheses, but they are highly vulnerable to cherry-picking, availability bias, and the expert's personal limitations. One case can prove something is possible. It cannot prove something is typical. At the bottom sits anecdote and intuition, someone's personal experience or gut feeling. This is where most everyday claims actually live. Someone tried something once and it worked. Someone feels strongly that something is true. This is not worthless information, but it is the weakest form of evidence, and it should never drive important decisions without corroboration from higher levels. A 2019 study published in the journal Judgment and Decision Making examined how executives weighted different forms of evidence. They found that anecdotes and case studies disproportionately influence decisions, often overriding statistical data from larger samples. The researchers called this the narrative trap. Stories feel more real than numbers. Vivid examples seem more relevant than abstract aggregates. But feelings about evidence quality are almost exactly inverted from actual evidence quality. Here is a practical framework for demanding evidence in real situations. When someone makes a claim, ask yourself, what level of the evidence hierarchy is this based on? If they cite a systematic review of multiple studies, you can have high confidence. If they cite a single case where something worked, you should have low confidence, regardless of how compelling the story sounds. Then ask the follow-up question. Is this evidence appropriate for this claim? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If someone claims a modest improvement from a proven method, a small study might be sufficient. If someone claims a revolutionary breakthrough that contradicts established understanding, you need much stronger evidence before adjusting your beliefs. Let me show you how to ask for evidence without creating conflict. Many people avoid demanding evidence because it feels confrontational. They worry about seeming skeptical, difficult, or mistrustful. So they accept claims and hope for the best. But asking for evidence does not require accusation. It requires curiosity. There is a profound difference between demanding, prove it, with hostility and asking, what's that based on, with genuine interest. Here are phrases that request evidence while maintaining collaboration. I want to make sure I understand the foundation here. What data are we basing this on? That's an interesting conclusion. What did the research actually show? Before we move forward, can we look at the evidence behind this assumption? I want to be confident in this direction. What would we point to if someone asked us to justify this choice? These phrasings accomplish two things. They request evidence directly, and they frame the request as shared due diligence rather than personal attack. You are not challenging the person. You are helping the group make a well-founded decision. There is another skill you need to develop: recognizing when evidence is missing without anyone noticing. Often, claims are made and accepted without any evidence being offered at all. The conversation moves so quickly, the speaker seems so confident, and the social pressure is strong enough that nobody pauses to ask the foundational question. A 2021 study from the Harvard Business School analyzed transcripts of strategic planning meetings at 37 companies. They found that 61% of key assumptions underlying strategic decisions were never supported by cited evidence during the meetings. They were simply stated and accepted. When researchers later asked executives about the evidence basis for these assumptions, most could not provide it. The assumptions had become organizational beliefs through repetition, not verification. This is the evidence vacuum. Claims flow freely. Confidence is high, and the entire edifice is built on unexamined foundations. Your job is to notice when evidence is missing, not always to demand it aloud, though often you should, but at minimum to recognize internally that a claim has been made without support and to adjust your confidence accordingly. When you hear a claim without evidence, your internal response should be, "This is a hypothesis, not a fact. I will treat it as uncertain until I see data." This simple mental adjustment prevents you from building plans on foundations that do not exist. Here is where things get complicated. Sometimes evidence is offered, but it is bad evidence. And bad evidence can be more dangerous than no evidence because it creates false confidence. You think you have a foundation when you actually have an illusion. Let me give you the red flags that indicate evidence should be questioned further. Red flag 1. The sample is too small. A study of 12 people cannot support broad generalizations. A test in one market cannot predict results in all markets. Small samples produce noisy results that may not replicate. Red flag 2. The comparison is missing. Knowing that 40% of customers like the product tells you nothing without knowing the baseline. Was it 20% before? 60%? Without comparison, raw numbers are uninterpretable. Red flag 3. Correlation is presented as causation. Two things happening together does not mean one causes the other. Companies with foosball tables might have higher revenue, but removing the foosball table will not decrease revenue. The common cause is company culture, not the table. Red flag 4. Survivorship bias is present. You only see the successes, not the failures. Every successful entrepreneur dropped out of college. But for every dropout who succeeded, thousands failed silently. Studying only survivors creates distorted conclusions. Red flag 5. The source has obvious conflicts of interest. A study funded by an industry group showing that industry's product is beneficial deserves extra scrutiny. The evidence might still be valid, but the incentive structure requires independent verification. A 2020 study in the British Medical Journal found that industry-funded research was 4 times more likely to report favorable conclusions than independently funded research on the same questions. The individual studies often looked methodologically sound, but the funding source predicted the direction of findings with remarkable consistency. Now let me give you a practical protocol for evidence evaluation. When evidence is presented, run through this checklist. What level of the evidence hierarchy is this? Meta-analysis, controlled trial, observational study, case study, or anecdote? Is the sample large enough and representative enough to support the conclusion? Is there a proper comparison or control, or just raw numbers? Does the evidence show correlation or causation? And which does the claim require? Are there survivorship or selection effects that might distort what we are seeing? Does the source have conflicts of interest that might influence findings or reporting? This checklist takes less than a minute to run through mentally, and it fundamentally changes your relationship with evidence. Instead of passively accepting what is presented, you actively evaluate its strength. You know what you actually know versus what you are being asked to assume. The average professional accepts evidence based on presentation quality. If the slides look good, the numbers seem precise, and the speaker is confident, the evidence must be solid. This is a catastrophic error. Presentation quality and evidence quality are unrelated. Some of the best designed presentations contain fatally flawed evidence. Some of the ugliest spreadsheets contain the most rigorous data. The elite professional evaluates evidence based on structural quality. They ask the hard questions regardless of how the information is packaged. They know that their job is not to be impressed. Their job is to be accurate. There is one more element I want to address before we move to step 6. Sometimes you will demand evidence and receive a confident response that the evidence exists without actually being shown the evidence. We have data on this. Research supports this conclusion. This has been proven. These responses feel like evidence. They are not. They are claims about evidence. And claims about evidence require the same scrutiny as any other claim. The appropriate response is, can I see the data? Can you point me to the research? What specifically was proven and how? Sometimes this reveals that the evidence is solid and available. Good. Now you can evaluate it directly. Sometimes this reveals that the evidence is weaker than implied, or different from what was suggested, or actually does not exist. Also good. Now you know what you are actually working with. The discomfort of asking these follow-up questions is trivial compared to the cost of making decisions based on phantom evidence. You now have step 5 installed. You understand the difference between reasons and evidence. You know the evidence hierarchy and how to calibrate confidence accordingly. You have red flags for questionable evidence. And you have a protocol for demanding and evaluating evidence without creating unnecessary conflict. But even with perfect evidence, there is one more trap waiting. Your emotional state can distort how you interpret evidence, which conclusions you draw, and which actions you take. In Chapter 8, you will learn to separate emotion from data, not by suppressing what you feel, but by ensuring that feelings inform rather than contaminate your analysis. Chapter 8, Step 6, Separate emotion from data. 5 years from now, you will look back on a decision you are about to make. Perhaps it is a career move. Perhaps it is a major investment. Perhaps it is a strategic choice that will define your next chapter. In one version of that future, you will feel deep satisfaction. You made the call with clarity. You saw what was real, acted accordingly, and the outcome validated your judgment. In another version, you will feel the specific sting of regret that comes from knowing you saw the warning signs but ignored them. Not because you lacked intelligence, not because the information was hidden, but because your emotions convinced you that what felt right was the same as what was right. These two futures diverge at a single point. The moment you either separated feeling from analysis or let them blur together. This chapter is about making sure you end up in the first future. Let me begin by correcting a dangerous misconception. Many people believe that emotions are the enemy of good thinking. They imagine the ideal decision maker as a cold, calculating machine who feels nothing and processes everything through pure logic. This is wrong. Completely, demonstrably, dangerously wrong. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio spent decades studying patients with damage to the emotional centers of their brains. These patients could reason logically. They could analyze options. They could articulate pros and cons with perfect clarity. And they could not make decisions. Simple choices paralyzed them. Selecting a restaurant took hours of deliberation without resolution. Their lives fell apart not because they felt too much, but because they felt too little. Damasio's research, published in his landmark work on the neuroscience of decision-making, demonstrated that emotions are not opposed to rationality. They are essential to it. Emotions provide the valuation system that tells you what matters. They signal what to approach and what to avoid. They compress vast amounts of information into immediate feelings that guide action. The problem is not that you have emotions. The problem is that emotions can override analysis when they should inform it. The problem is that feelings about a decision can become confused with facts about a decision. The problem is that what feels true can silence what is true. Step 6 is not about suppressing emotion. It is about positioning it correctly in your decision process. Here is the framework. Emotions should enter your decision-making at 2 points, the beginning and the end. At the beginning, emotions help you identify what matters. They tell you which decisions deserve attention, which outcomes you care about, and what your values prioritize. At the end, after analysis is complete, emotions provide a final check. If the logical conclusion feels deeply wrong, that feeling contains information worth examining. But in the middle, during the analysis itself, emotions must be held aside. This is the zone where you gather evidence, evaluate sources, check logic, and assess probabilities. In this zone, Feelings contaminate rather than contribute. They make you see evidence that is not there. They make you dismiss evidence that is there. They transform analysis into rationalization. The average decision maker allows emotions to flow through the entire process without separation. They feel enthusiastic about an opportunity, so they find reasons to pursue it. They feel anxious about a choice, so they find reasons to avoid it. The feeling comes first. The analysis follows, shaped invisibly to match. The elite decision maker creates a boundary. They acknowledge their feelings fully. They do not pretend to be robots. But when it is time to analyze, they consciously set feelings aside and ask, what does the data actually show, independent of what I wanted to show? Let me give you a practical technique for creating this separation. It is called the emotional audit, and it takes less than 2 minutes. Before you analyze a decision, pause and answer these questions honestly. What am I hoping is true here? What outcome do I want? What would I prefer the evidence to show? What am I afraid might be true? What outcome would disappoint or threaten me? What do I hope the evidence does not show? What is at stake for my identity or ego? Would being right about this make me feel good about myself? Would being wrong be embarrassing or costly to my self-image? Write the answers down if possible. Say them out loud if not. The act of explicit acknowledgement reduces the power of hidden emotional influences. A 2018 study from the Wharton School tested this approach with financial analysts making investment recommendations. Analysts who completed an emotional audit before evaluating opportunities made recommendations that were 23% more accurate than those who dove straight into analysis. The audit did not change their feelings. It changed their relationship to their feelings. By surfacing hidden hopes and fears, it prevented those hopes and fears from covertly shaping conclusions. Now let me show you the specific ways emotions contaminate analysis. The first is motivated reasoning. When you want a conclusion to be true, you unconsciously apply stricter standards to evidence against it and looser standards to evidence for it. You are not aware of doing this. You experience yourself as being objective, but the evaluation is rigged before it begins. Researchers at Yale demonstrated this in a 2017 study. Participants evaluated the methodology of scientific studies. When studies reached conclusions they disagreed with, participants found significantly more methodological flaws. When studies reached conclusions they agreed with, the same methodological issues went unnoticed. The participants were not lying. They genuinely believed they were evaluating fairly. The motivation operated below conscious awareness. The antidote is to apply your scrutiny evenly. Ask yourself, am I evaluating evidence I like with the same rigor as evidence I dislike? Am I looking for flaws as hard in confirming studies as in disconfirming ones? The second contamination is mood-congruent perception. Your current emotional state colors how you perceive new information. When you are optimistic, opportunities look more promising and risks look more manageable. When you are anxious, threats loom larger and resources seem more scarce. The same information produces different perceptions depending on your mood when you encounter it. A 2019 study in the Journal of Behavioral Decision Making tracked executives making strategic decisions across different mood states. Decisions made in positive moods were 31% more likely to underestimate risks. Decisions made in anxious moods were 40% more likely to reject opportunities that post hoc analysis showed were sound. The mood at the time of decision predicted systematic distortions in judgment. The antidote is timing awareness. Before major decisions, check your current state. Are you unusually optimistic or pessimistic right now? Is something unrelated affecting your mood? If so, consider delaying the decision until your state is more neutral, or explicitly adjust for the known direction of distortion. The third contamination is emotional anchoring. Strong feelings from the past attach to present situations that superficially resemble them. A previous failure makes you overly cautious in situations that look similar, even when they are fundamentally different. A previous success makes you overconfident in situations that feel familiar, even when the conditions have changed. Your emotional memory is associative, not analytical. It matches patterns and imports feelings from the match. This happened before. It felt like this. Therefore, this situation will produce the same outcome. but the match is often superficial. The new situation has different parameters, different contexts, different odds. Your emotional response is calibrated to the past, not the present. The antidote is pattern interruption. When you notice strong feelings about a decision, ask, am I reacting to this situation or to a previous situation this reminds me of? What are the actual differences between then and now? Does my emotional response account for those differences? Let me give you an example of emotional separation in practice. Imagine you are evaluating whether to hire a candidate. During the interview, you felt an immediate connection. They reminded you of a successful colleague from years ago. Their energy was engaging. You left the conversation feeling enthusiastic. Without emotional separation, you would proceed to analysis with a hidden verdict already in place. You would evaluate their credentials looking for confirmation. You would interpret ambiguous references positively. You would construct a case for hiring that feels like objective assessment but is actually post hoc justification. With emotional separation, you acknowledge the feeling first. I felt a strong positive connection. I noticed resemblance to someone successful. My enthusiasm might be pattern matching, not evidence. Then you set the feeling aside and analyze the actual data. What do the credentials specifically show? What did references actually say? How do their skills match the job requirements? What concerns exist regardless of my feelings? Finally, you allow emotion back in as a check. After reviewing the data, how do I feel about this decision? Does the logical conclusion match or conflict with my gut response? If they conflict, which specific evidence can I point to that justifies the logical conclusion over the emotional one? This process does not eliminate emotion. It positions emotion correctly. Feeling serves as bookends, not as the analysis itself. Here is a harder truth you need to accept. Sometimes the emotion is the signal and the analysis is the distortion. Your gut might detect something that your conscious reasoning has missed. Pattern recognition operates below awareness and can perceive dangers or opportunities before you can articulate them. This is why step 6 is separation, not suppression. If you silence emotions entirely, you lose access to genuine intuition. The goal is to prevent emotions from hijacking analysis while still listening to what they might be telling you. The distinction is this: use emotion as a flag, not as a verdict. When you feel something strongly, that feeling is information worth examining. It is saying, pay attention here. But it is not saying, I have already determined the correct conclusion. The appropriate response to strong emotion is investigation, not obedience. What is this feeling detecting? What am I sensing that might not be captured in the explicit data? And when I look for evidence of what the feeling suggests, do I find it? A 2020 study in psychological science examined experienced investors who reported strong gut feelings about investment decisions. When those investors investigated their feelings by seeking additional evidence, their decisions improved significantly. When they either ignored their feelings entirely or obeyed them without investigation, their decisions degraded. The feeling was a starting point, not an ending point. The average professional has an unstable relationship with emotion. Sometimes they trust their gut completely because it feels so right. Sometimes they suppress their feelings entirely because they have been told to be rational. Both extremes produce errors. The elite professional has a consistent protocol. They surface emotions explicitly. They set them aside during analysis. They welcome them back as a final check. And they investigate any strong feelings rather than obeying or ignoring them. This protocol does not happen automatically. It must be practiced until it becomes habitual. Every decision where you consciously apply emotional separation strengthens the pattern. Over time, it becomes your natural mode of operation. You now have step 6 installed. You understand that emotions are essential to decision-making but must be positioned correctly. You have the emotional audit technique for surfacing hidden influences. You know the 3 main contamination patterns and their antidotes. And you have a framework for using emotion as a flag rather than a verdict. There is one step remaining. You have questioned the claim, checked the source, spotted the bias, tested the logic, demanded evidence, and separated emotion from data. Now you must decide. In Chapter 9, you will learn the final step, deciding with clarity. Not endless analysis, not impulsive leaps, A protocol for reaching clear conclusions when perfect certainty is impossible, which is always, because thinking is only valuable when it leads to action. Chapter 9. Decide with clarity. On the morning of October 14, 1962, President John F. Kennedy received photographs that would bring humanity closer to extinction than any moment before or since. Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, operational within days, capable of reaching Washington in 13 minutes. His military advisors unanimously recommended immediate airstrikes. The logic seemed unassailable. Destroy the missiles before they become operational. Eliminate the threat while elimination is still possible. Kennedy had every reason to follow this advice. The experts were unified. The reasoning was sound. The pressure to act was immense. A decisive strike would demonstrate American resolve. Instead, he paused. Not from weakness, not from indecision, from a systematic process of examining alternatives that his advisors had prematurely foreclosed. He demanded evidence for assumptions that everyone treated as facts. He appointed his brother to argue the opposing position. He forced the group to generate options beyond the false binary of strike or accept. 13 days later, the crisis resolved without nuclear war. Historians estimate that following the unanimous expert recommendation would have triggered a Soviet response killing approximately 100 million people within the first hour. The difference between catastrophe and survival was not intelligence. Kennedy was not smarter than his advisors. The difference was a decision protocol that prevented premature closure and forced systematic examination when every instinct screamed to act immediately. This is step 7, and it is where everything you have learned either transforms into action or dies as unused knowledge. Let me give you the core truth that governs this step. You will never have complete information, not for any decision that matters. The future is permanently uncertain. Variables remain hidden. Outcomes depend on factors beyond prediction or control. If you wait for certainty, you wait forever. And while you wait, opportunities close, costs accumulate, and circumstances evolve without your input. The average professional treats uncertainty as a problem to be solved before deciding. They gather more data, consult more experts, run more analyses. They believe certainty exists somewhere, accessible with sufficient effort. The elite professional treats uncertainty as a permanent condition to be managed, not eliminated. They ask a different question. Not, am I certain? But, do I have enough to decide reasonably? This distinction separates paralysis from progress. Here is the decision protocol that makes clarity possible. First, categorize the decision. Is it reversible or irreversible? Reversible decisions can be undone with reasonable cost. Hiring with a probation period. Testing a strategy in a limited market. Trying a new approach with the ability to revert. For reversible decisions, speed beats extensive analysis. Decide, observe, adjust. Irreversible decisions cannot be easily undone. Major contracts, public commitments, resource allocations that foreclose other options. For these, invest appropriately in analysis, but recognize that appropriately does not mean indefinitely. Second, identify what would change your decision. What specific information, if you had it, would materially alter your choice. Be precise. Vague desires for more data are avoidance disguised as diligence. Third, assess whether you can obtain that information. If it exists and is accessible with reasonable effort, get it. If it cannot be obtained, or would take so long that circumstances would change, you must proceed without it. Fourth, compare the cost of waiting to the cost of being wrong. Delayed decisions have real costs. Missed opportunities, prolonged uncertainty, resources consumed in deliberation. Often, waiting costs more than an imperfect decision that can be corrected. Fifth, if you had to decide right now, what would you choose? This question cuts through fog. It surfaces your actual judgment, revealing that you were often ready to decide all along, but hiding behind artificial uncertainty. A 2018 study from Duke University examined regret patterns in executives nearing retirement. The researchers asked what decisions they regretted most. Overwhelmingly, the regrets were not about wrong decisions. They were about unmade decisions, opportunities not pursued, changes not attempted, clarity not reached when it was needed. Inaction haunted them far more than imperfect action. There is one more technique that dramatically improves decision quality. Before committing to any significant choice, run a pre-mortem. Assume the decision has already failed. Imagine yourself 1 year in the future, looking back at disaster. Ask, what caused the failure? What did I miss? What assumption proved false? This technique, developed by psychologist Gary Klein, surfaces concerns that normal analysis suppresses. When you ask what could go wrong, your brain generates optimistic scenarios because you want success. When you assume failure has already occurred, you think critically about vulnerabilities. Research at the Wharton School found that teams using pre-mortem analysis identified 30% more risks than teams using traditional planning. Not preventing all failures, but ensuring informed choice rather than blind hope. After the pre-mortem, address what you discovered. Some risks can be mitigated. Some can be monitored. Some are acceptable given the upside. But now you decide with awareness, not false confidence. Once you decide, commit. Do not endlessly revisit. The same critical thinking that helped you reach the decision will help you navigate whatever comes next. Channel energy into execution rather than questioning whether you should have decided differently. This does not mean ignoring new information. If circumstances change materially, update. But routine doubt without new information is not critical thinking. It is anxiety wearing the mask of diligence. You now have the complete 7-step system. Question the claim. Check the source. Spot the bias. Test the logic. Demand evidence. Separate emotion from data. Decide with clarity. But knowing a system is not the same as living it. In the final chapter, you will learn how to transform these steps from occasional tools into your permanent operating system. Because the difference between understanding critical thinking and becoming a critical thinker is practice. Chapter 10. The Critical Thinker's Daily Practice. Everything you have learned will be worthless by next week. Not because the system is flawed, because your brain will return to its defaults the moment pressure arrives. Research from University College London found that the window for converting knowledge into lasting behavior is brutally short. People who apply new skills within 24 hours are 14 times more likely to retain them after 90 days than people who wait even 1 week. Your neural pathways are primed right now. What you do before tomorrow morning determines whether critical thinking becomes who you are or merely something you once understood. This chapter is about making sure it becomes who you are. The daily practice has 3 components: morning calibration, real-time application, evening review. Together, they take less than 15 minutes. They produce compounding returns that transform judgment over weeks. Morning calibration takes 3 minutes. Before information floods in, set your mental frame. Ask 3 questions. What decision might I face today that deserves careful thought? This primes recognition of important moments. What bias am I most susceptible to right now, given my current state and pressures? Naming it reduces its power. What belief am I holding that I have never actually examined? Surfacing one each morning builds the questioning habit. A 2020 study from Wharton tested this approach with financial analysts. Those who spent 3 minutes on calibration questions before their workday showed 27% better decision quality over 6 weeks. The effect compounded. Small daily investments produced substantial cumulative returns. Real-time application happens throughout your day. You do not run the full system on everything. You develop graduated responses. For low-stakes information, is this a claim or a fact? One question, 1 second, shifts you from passive absorption to active evaluation. For medium-stakes decisions, what is this based on? What bias might be operating? And what is the evidence? 30 seconds, catches most common errors. For high-stakes decisions, the complete 7-step system. Minutes or days depending on magnitude. The skill is calibration, matching analytical investment to actual stakes. With practice, your brain learns which situations require deep attention and which can be handled quickly. Pattern recognition develops. Certain signals trigger automatic scrutiny. Evening review takes 5 minutes. Before sleep, when your brain consolidates experience into memory, conduct a brief retrospective. 3 questions. What decision did I make today that I am most uncertain about? Examine it briefly. Build pattern recognition for similar future situations. When did I accept a claim without examination? There is always at least one moment. Identifying it calibrates tomorrow's attention. What did I learn that might change a belief I hold? This keeps you open to updating. If you never find anything, you are not looking hard enough. UCLA research demonstrated that 5 minutes of end-of-day reflection accelerates skill acquisition by 40% compared to additional practice time. Reflection converts raw experience into transferable wisdom. Without it, you accumulate events without extracting lessons. There is an obstacle you must expect. You will forget. You will skip calibration. You will abandon review for days. You will catch yourself accepting claims you should have questioned. This is normal. The question is not whether you will lapse. The question is whether you will restart. Duke University's Center for Advanced Hindsight found that the number of lapses did not predict habit success. What predicted success was restart speed. People who restarted within 1 day maintained their habits. People who waited multiple days usually abandoned them entirely. So when you forget, restart immediately. Not Monday. Not next week. Today. One more practice accelerates everything. Find a thinking partner. One person committed to developing the same skills. A weekly 20-minute conversation where you discuss decisions you faced, biases you caught, claims you examined. Accountability. External perspective. Normalization of the practice. A meta-analysis in the Review of Educational Research found that social learning outperforms solo practice across virtually every skill studied. Critical thinking is no exception. There is one more layer that turns this from a routine into an identity. Make the practice visible. Most people fail not because they disagree with the method, but because the method stays invisible in the exact moment it is needed. So create a single page, paper or digital, that becomes your thinking dashboard. At the top, write your 3 calibration questions. Under that, write your 3 review questions. Then add a short red flag list, signals that should automatically slow you down. Time pressure, authority confidence, group unanimity, strong emotion, unusually high rewards, and any claim that discourages questions. When one of those flags appears, you do not debate whether to think. You trigger the system. Now add one tool to capture your learning. A decision journal that takes 60 seconds. Every time you make a medium or high-stakes decision, write 3 lines. The decision, the reason, the risk you might be underestimating. That is it. You are not writing a diary. You are building an archive of patterns. A week later, skim the last 5 entries and ask, where was I right? Where was I wrong? And what did I miss? This loop shifts you from judging yourself by feelings to judging yourself by evidence, which is the core of critical thinking. Finally, pre-commit to one pause rule for pressure. Choose a sentence you will use when stakes rise. I want to think for 60 seconds before I answer. Or, I'll get back to you by tomorrow with a clear decision. Saying it out loud protects your process. It buys you the space to apply the system. And over time, the people around you learn something important. You do not react on demand. You respond with clarity. Here is who you are becoming. Someone who pauses when others react. Not slow. Strategic. Someone who asks when others assume. Not difficult. Accurate. Someone who sees when others miss. Not smarter. Trained. Someone who decides when others deliberate endlessly. Not reckless. Clear. Someone who updates when others defend. Not weak. Strong. This transformation happens through thousands of small moments. Each time you question instead of accept. Each time you examine instead of assume. Each time you decide instead of delay. The 7 steps are simple. A child could memorize them. Living them is the work of a lifetime. Not because it is complicated, because it requires consistent practice in a world that constantly pulls toward mindlessness. You have everything you need. The framework is installed. The daily practice is defined. What remains is the choice you make in the next 24 hours. You can proceed as you always have, letting information wash over you, reacting to claims, making decisions on autopilot. Or you can take 3 minutes tomorrow morning. Ask yourself what decision deserves your attention. Name the bias you are most susceptible to. Surface one unexamined belief. 3 minutes. That is where transformation begins. The assassins have been operating freely your entire life. They have shaped beliefs you think are yours. They have influenced decisions you thought were rational. They have cost you opportunities, relationships, money, and time in ways you will never fully calculate. Starting tomorrow, their reign ends. Not because you will become perfect, because you will become systematic. And systematic beats genius every single time.